Remember Dr. Seuss? Cat in the Hat, Fox in Socks, the Lorax, the Grinch? Might feel a bit dated now, but it's iconic stuff. Honestly, looking back, it's probably even better than you remember. I mean, there's some real art in there. That sense of whimsical absurdity, all those smoothed over, curvy, pleasantly chaotic worlds, environments where everything looks like it's made from a layer of half-melted frosting. It taps a very unique sense of tranquility and anxious tension all at once. It's pleasant, it's whimsical, but it's also surreal, weirdly tenuous. There's really nothing quite like it. Except, there sort of is. Sort of. If you traded the sneetches on the beaches for sun-cracked mud huts dotting a dried-out, marshy plain, you could just start to see it. If you replaced Mount Crumpet with a mutilated finger of knuckled masonry pointing blasphemously at heaven, if, surrounding that tower, rather than the swerving, curving architecture of Seussland, you imagined a dilapidated castle the size of a city made up of gray stone spires and tangling halls, if you replaced the repetitions and rhymes of Seuss's characters with rambling non sequiturs and painful monologues, if you allowed the child protagonists, always more clever than any adult, to fail, to suffer, to die, if you did all of this and left the rest of the Seussiness in there intact, you would have something close but very different. Something with all the same whimsical absurdity, but darker, more world-wise, more willing not just to play with the absurd, but to embrace it. You would have an artist that the world forgot. The Dr. Seuss of Gothic fiction, Mervyn Peake. Just so you know, when you're done with this video, there's actually still a lot more left to watch. If you've ever been curious about how we make Foundry, our humans have recently started doing a series of videos about that very thing. It's called Behind the Machines, and you can watch it right now, only on Nebula. Just visit nebula.tv/Foundry to get started. It would mean so much to me if you went and checked it out. I don't expect the name Mervyn Peake to mean much to you. That's why we didn't put it in the thumbnail. He's not a figure who ever really found his way into the zeitgeist, at least not the way Seuss did. Out of all the many, probably hundreds of things he wrote and published, there's only one that ever really touched anything close to that fame. If you've heard of Mervyn Peake, it's probably because you've heard of his weird 3-part Gothic fantasy of manners, Gormenghast. Gormenghast is not an easy thing to describe. There's too much to say. The short version is this. There is a castle. There is a royal family. There is an unlikely new heir, and with his birth, a sense that things are, for the first time in a very long time, about to change. The dust is stirring in Castle Gormenghast, and everyone can feel it. It's significant because there's an ancient oppressiveness to this place. The gray, cracked stone, the nonsensically twisting labyrinthine halls, the darknesses within darknesses. But there's a strange sense of abandon, too. Almost like here in the guts of the castle, very little matters. Nobody seems to think very much. They merely adhere to tradition, almost as their one lifeline to sanity. Otherwise, they all seem quite as mad as the castle itself. Lord Sepulchrave, the Earl of Gormenghast, mainly sits at the head of an empty court, watching paint peel off the ancient ceilings, musing about his own inconsolable misery. Flay, his right-hand man, picks his way through the darkness like a skeletal shadow, knees creaking unmistakably with every step. Countess Gertrude, the formidable wife of the Earl, spends all day locked away in her bedroom with a legion of fluffy white cats. Swelter, the immense, madly raving, self-important kitchen master, monologues in grandiose verse to his core of ragamuffin kitchen boys. Even Steerpike, the only character who even comes close to anything resembling a protagonist, is little more than a weird boy with a Napoleon complex, constantly trying to manipulate all the deluded caricatures around him. Nobody in this story is likable, really, which is weird because I love all of them. At best, they're obnoxious. At worst, they're just terrible people. But at all times, they're just too ridiculous to hate. I want to know what happens to them, even if I don't want them to succeed, because I know that whatever happens, it's going to be hysterical. And that's kind of what makes Peake such an incredible author to me. That odd sense of humor in the darkness. The laughing not at, but with the shadows. I did have to sort of fight for that experience, though, because, I won't mince words, it is hard to read, like physically difficult. Here, let me just try to read a passage to you so you get the idea. Swelter's eyes met those of his enemy, and never has there held between four globes of gristle so sinister a hell of hatred. Had the flesh, the fibers, and the bones of the chef and those of Mr. Flay been conjured away and away down that dark corridor, leaving only their 4 eyes suspended in midair outside the Earl's door, then surely they must have reddened the hue of Mars, reddened and smoldered and at last broken into flame, so intense was their hatred, broken into flame and circled about one another in ever-narrowing gyres and yet swifter flight until, merged into one sizzling globe of ire, they must surely have fled, the 4 in one, leaving a trail of blood behind them in the cold grey air of the corridor, until, screaming as they fly beneath innumerable arches and down the endless passageways of Gormenghast, they found their eyeless bodies once again and re-entrenched themselves in startled sockets. That was 2 sentences. The whole trilogy is like this. So, taking all of this together, the weird mixing of tones, the difficult-to-swallow perfume of the text itself, I'm not actually surprised that this, his most well-known work, is barely known at all. I mean, these books were being published in the 40s and 50s. They would have been on the fantasy shelf right beside Lord of the Rings. World War II had just ended. I suspect most of his potential readers would have found Middle-earth a more appealing escape than Castle Gormenghast at the time. But I don't know, when would the right time for Gormenghast be? It's not exactly a series that lends itself to marketing. Trust me, I've spent years trying to figure out how to make this video. Which brings me back to the Seuss comparison. You must be wondering about that by now. Look at some of these illustrations Peake did for Gormenghast. I wasn't comparing them for no reason. You can clearly see the similarities in their styles. Peake's work's a little bit rough around the edges, maybe, compared to Seuss, sure, but they share this hyperbolic, over-the-top weirdness. This fluid, cartoonish quality is one of the things that made Seuss so well-suited to writing children's stories. And, despite everything, the same is true for Peake, too. In the 50s, he wrote a play for kids called Noah's Ark. It follows a little boy who has a dream about meeting Noah and attempts to warn him about the coming flood. Despite the name, it wasn't a moralistic Bible story at all. In fact, Peake's interpretation of Noah's Ark is entirely secular, with all references to God removed. After supplies start to run low on the Ark, the animals, of course, stage a mutiny. In signature Peake fashion, the child is the only competent one on board. Noah doesn't heed his warnings and walks right into an ambush. The play ends with the animals about to maul Noah and his family, when the dove returns with the olive branch, signaling that it had found dry land. Everyone is so relieved by this that they decide to let bygones be bygones, and Noah's family avoids dismemberment for another day. Peake also wrote a ton of nonsense poems geared toward kids. These reminded me a little bit of the style that Shel Silverstein would popularize a couple of decades later. They're short, sarcastic, usually feature made-up words, and end with a punchline of some kind. Here's one from his collection, 5 Rhymes Without Reason, published in 1944. The jailer and the jaguar keep wandering through the rain. The jailer and the swagwar, the jaguar with the pain. They search for warmth and clothes to mend, but mostly for their wives, who left them long ago to lend more color to their lives. And people didn't really know what to make of that, I don't think. Frankly, I don't either. Obviously, it means nothing. It's even in the title, Rhymes Without Reason. Peake tells you right out of the gate that these poems aren't meant to make any sense. If you're looking for a book of poetry that would have some valuable lessons to teach your kids, you're not going to find it here. Even though I personally find these fun and unburdened, I can see why parents in the 40s and 50s may have found this work to be tasteless compared to the standard works of the time. Meanwhile, those same mid-century parents were devouring Dr. Seuss's work. Even though Dr. Seuss had a similar sense of humor, his work was just easier to consume, I think. Kids loved The Cat in the Hat because it was fun. Parents liked it because it had a lesson about responsibility. Peake just wasn't like that. He may have written for kids, but he never pandered to them. He never did that for anybody, really. That isn't to say that Seuss's writing is somehow worse than Peake's word. They're just different. Seuss is relatively easy to understand and appreciate. With Peake, you either get it or you don't. And it seems like most people just didn't. My guess is that a lot of people who would have liked Peake's work just as much as Seuss's were scared off by the dissonance, that and the writing. Because despite all those shared qualities between them, Peake's stuff does get dark, especially when you get out of his children's fiction. Probably my favorite example of this, a poem called The Rime of the Flying Bomb, follows a sailor rescuing an infant from a destroyed house during an air raid. The two of them take shelter in a church where the sailor waxes on deliriously about eternity, a place the child had just been, and where the sailor was likely headed. And then, as if receiving a sign from heaven, they look up and rejoice to see a cross flying through the sky toward the church. What they're seeing, actually, is the underside of an unmanned bomber plane hurtling down toward them. They both die on impact, and the church they're in is destroyed. Not the kind of thing you find in a Dr. Seuss story. Peake was not a man who hesitated to pour his own life into his work. In 1940, Peake enlisted into the British Army. He wanted to be a war artist, but his application was turned down and he was sent to the front lines instead. Also, in 1940, his first son, Sebastian, was born. It couldn't have been easy witnessing some of the darkest moments in human history while knowing that back home, your wife was alone with a brand new baby. If you read some of his poems, there's this unmistakable and emotionally devastating theme of dying children. Watching all of this senseless violence and pairing it with the fear of suddenly having something to lose, it must have done a number on Peake. When you look at the lives of Peake and Seuss, it's almost like they mirrored each other. Two contemporaries creating stylistically similar work from two very different frames of reference. Seuss grew up in America and spent his childhood drawing pictures of animals at the zoo, which his father basically owned. Peake was raised in an isolated Chinese mission compound. Seuss contributed to the war effort by creating propaganda for the army, between writing bestsellers. When Peake petitioned to be a war artist, they made him paint lettering on the bathroom stalls. Seuss is a household name to this day. Peake has faded from the lips of the world. It almost seems like Peake's inner turmoil ruined his life, like he could never escape misfortune and darkness, like it followed him everywhere. But I don't think that's it. I think Peake brought those things with him. Seuss's work is absurd. There's no doubt about that. But it's a safe kind of absurd. A perfect fit for post-war sensibilities. I mean, after all that trauma, the absurdity of life would have been, to the average person, undeniable. But I think the cruelty of it would have also been exhausting. The war had just ended. Who could bear to think any more about death and destruction? But after all they had seen, they also couldn't pretend reality was something it's not. So, something else would surely have been nice. An escape. Something whimsical in material but absurd in tone. In that way, I suspect Seuss's work was very much a product of its time. And so was Peake's, just in the polar opposite way. Peak understood whimsy. He could certainly give you something to laugh at, but after looking at so much of his work, it seems that he didn't see it as this thing that you can isolate. In his art, comedy and tragedy are one and the same. To Peak, absurdity was not simply a matter of hyperbole or the unexpected or the surreal. He evokes it in a much more philosophical way. It's the kind of absurdity that says, yes, life is terrible. Yes, it is often pointless. Yes, you must live it. Yes, it is worthwhile. Maybe it wasn't a good fit for the time Peak was writing, but I think it's a sentiment that's steadily becoming more relatable. It's gotten harder to insulate yourself from all the hard truths of reality. Bad moments don't seem to end anymore. The world doesn't move on in quite the same way. It's a constant stream of suffering all day and all night. Not even kids can escape it. The worst news humanity has to offer is constantly at their fingertips. And when that's the case, I think it gets harder to believe in escapism. There's this overwhelming sense that if you can't see all of the world's darkness and laugh, you are doomed. You start to crave something more recognizable, a more familiar flavor of absurdity, something that holds more truth. The sugary sweet, melted frosting otherworld of Seuss becomes bitter in your mouth, and you just start to long for somewhere else. And, luckily, although it is much forgotten, one such place does exist. The dust is stirring in Castle Gormenghast. Can't you feel it? And I'm afraid that's all for this week. Our next video will be coming out in a week from now, so I'll see you then. Unless, of course, you don't want to wait. We've actually made a ton of stuff that isn't up here on YouTube, like this video about the morphology of angels and why artists always give them wings, or this one about artificial life as a magic system. We even do behind-the-scenes content over there, a regular series created by the humans behind this show, Behind the Machines. And, of course, if you just don't want to wait, next week's YouTube video is actually already out and ready to be watched. That's right. You can watch it right now, ad-free, along with everything else I just mentioned, over on our streaming platform, Nebula. YouTube is kind of a crazy place to make content. Don't get me wrong, I'm happy to have this platform, but you have to be so careful about your topic choices, your packaging, what you include in your videos. You just start to feel like you're walking on eggshells. Nebula doesn't have any of those concerns. It's an entirely different environment, devoid of all the weird YouTube cynicism. The entire platform was built by creators for creators. Every time you watch a video there, a creator you love is getting paid, and far more than they would ever get paid on YouTube. And on top of that, Nebula even helps its creators to fund incredible original content. You know, like our series, Worldsmiths. And we're not the only ones who have been busy over there. So many other amazing creators have started creating and sharing their own unique stuff on Nebula, like our friend Frankie from the channel A Bit Frank, or Tim from the channel Hello Future Me. Heck, there's even a high-production, independently run sci-fi audio drama over there called The Sojourn, which is just so good. I've been listening to it while working lately and loving every second of it. Nebula is just a really unique, fun, fresh environment. It kind of makes watching videos on the internet fun again. Speaking of which, here's the really fun part. Nebula is already cheaper than almost any other streaming platform on the internet, like $3 per month. That cheap. But we also do something that most platforms will never do. We give you the option to pay once and have Nebula for life. Just $300 one time and you never have to pay again. No matter how big the platform gets, how fancy the content gets, you can pay for this once and have access to it forever if you want to. All you have to do is click the link in the description or go to go.nebula.tv/talefoundry and sign up for 1 year. That's it. Again, that's just $3 a month or $300 one time to get access for life. Frankly, I'm not quite sure how they can afford to do all this, but I'm definitely not complaining. Seriously, take advantage of this offer while it's still going. I don't think any better one exists in the world of streaming. Anyway, that's all for this one. Thanks for watching and keep making stuff up. I'll see you next week. Bye!